Martin. My friendship with the Hitch has always been perfectly cloudless. It is a love whose month is ever May. Martin Ami. Events only elicited the above tribute from Martin, when in our real lives it was mid-September, and when the press had been making the very most of a disagreement we had been having in print about Stalin and Trotsky in the summer of 2001. Looking back, though, I am inclined to date the burgeoning refulgence of our love to something more like the calendar equivalent of April. Still, it was actually in the gloomy autumn of 1973, around the time of the Yom Kippur Ramadan War between Israel and Egypt, that we actually and properly met. To anchor the moment in time, Salvador Allende had just been murdered by Pinochet in Chile, W. H. Auden had died, James Fenton, the author of the most beautiful poems to come out of the Indochina War, had won the Eric Gregory Award for poetry and used the money to go off and live in Vietnam and Cambodia. At the age of 24, I had been hired to fill at least some of the void that he left behind at the New Statesman. Peter Ackroyd, literary editor of The Rival and raffishly Tory Spectator, was giving me a drink one evening after returning from a trip of his own to the Middle East, and he said in the inimitable quacking and croaking and mirthful voice of his, "I've got someone I think you should meet." When he told me the name, I rather offhandedly said that I believed we'd once met already, with Fenton at Oxford. Anyway, it was agreed that we would make up a threesome on the following evening at the same sawdust-infested wine bar called the Bunghole, where my New Statesman career had begun. Lovers often invest their first meetings with the retrospective significance, as if to try and conjure the elements of the numinous out of the stubborn witness of the everyday. I can remember it all very well. Ackroyd doing his best to be a good host. It's a fearsome responsibility to promise two acquaintances that they will be sure to get along well with one another. And Martin, rather languid and understated. He did not, for example, even pretend to remember when I said we had met before with our other mutual friend Fenton. A verse letter to him from Clive James, published in Encounter at about this period, described Martin as resembling a stubby Jagger. I remembered this because of how very exact it seemed. He was more blond than Jagger, and indeed rather shorter, but his sensuous lower lip was a crucial feature. I didn't then know that he had thought he was the most vulnerable in the mouth. And there was no doubt that you would always know when he had come into the room. His office performed, Ackroyd withdrew, and the remaining pair of us later played some desultory pinball in another bar. I noticed that Martin had the gift of mimicry. He could drop or raise his voice and alter his features and just simply be the person we were talking about. I cannot now remember who. He asked me which novelist I enjoyed, and I first mentioned Graham Greene. This answer palpably did not excite him with his adventurousness. In answer to my reciprocal question, he said that he thought that one had to look for something between the twin peaks of Dickens and Nabokov. And it came back to me that Fenton had said to me how almost frighteningly assured all Martin's literary essays were turning out to be. I don't recollect how the evening ended. But some kind of mutuality had been stirred, and we soon enough had dinner with our retrospective girlfriends in some Cypriot taverna in Camden Town, where things went with a swing, and I can remember making him laugh. Then Yvonne died, and I vanished from London and from life for a bit, to discover on my return that Martin had taken the trouble to write me a brief, well-phrased, memorable note of condolence. A lesson for life. Always, when in doubt, please do send letters of commiseration. At the very least, they will be appreciated, and at the best, they may even succeed in their apparently futile ambition of lightening the burden of bereavement. The next I knew, I was invited to a small party to celebrate the publication of Martin's first novel, The Rachel Papers. Chat about this literary debut had been in the wind for a while, and Martin had an editorial position at the Times Literary Supplement, as well as a mounting reputation as a reviewer and which of course could be made to an Urkin, the same surname as one of the most famous novelists writing in English. Thus it seemed rather odd that he should be throwing his own book party, in his own small and shared flat at his own expense. But I am glad of it, because those of us who had the good luck and good taste to attend were later able to reminisce rather triumphantly. The 1973-74 apparel was absurd, of course, cowboy boots and flared trousers. For some of the men, those ill-advised cross-hatch blue jeans designed to resemble armor for me in particular. And Christ knows what for the girls. Sobriety and corduroy were supplied. However, by Ami Sr. and by his friend Robert Conquest, the great poet and even greater historian of Stalinism. In the International Socialist, we made his book on the Great Terror required reading. But that didn't mean I didn't suspect him, and Kingsley too, of pronounced reactionary tendencies. This was mainly because of the reprehensible line they had both taken over Vietnam. Yet I was easily aware that Kingsley's Girl 20, with its ridiculing of 60s morality and mentality, was rather hard to laugh off. Then there was Clive James, dressed as usual like someone who had assembled his wardrobe in the pitch dark, but always on, and always awash in cross-references and apt allusions. The presence of these few but gravity-donating figures, plus the climb up the stairs from Pont Street on the fringes of Chelsea, made me conserve my breath for a time. I had, in fact, met both Kingers and Conkers, as they were sometimes known, before, but I was very aware that my roadworthiness, Martin prefers the term seaworthiness, in real grown-up company, was not to be assumed, at any rate, not by me. The main event of my evening turned out, in any case, to take place at the opposite end of the age and gender scale. It suddenly seemed to me that Martin's sister Sally did not perhaps find me entirely repulsive. As the evening gently evaporated, I found myself taking her arm in the street and seeing, through quite a lot of fog, I now remember, the looming bulk of the Cadogan Hotel. Perhaps a little flown with wine, I suddenly and confusedly felt that it might be a fine thing to take her to the very place where Oscar Wilde had been arrested. I couldn't possibly afford it, but then, as I thought about it, I couldn't possibly afford not to do it, once I had thought about it. The Wilde suite itself was not available, but we did procure a decent room, and things proceeded happily enough. Ghost of Oscar or no ghost of Oscar, I did briefly allow myself to wonder if there was anything remotely subliminal or oblique in what I was doing. Sally had rather the same coloring as the brother I was beginning to adore, though not all the same face. It was years until it was established that she was not Kingsley's daughter, but that's another tale altogether. I find now that I can more or less acquit myself on any charge of having desired Martin carnally. My looks by then had, in any case, declined to the point where only women would go to bed with me. What eventuated instead was the most heterosexual relationship that one young man could conceivably have with another. As the days became weeks and the months became seasons, and as we fell happily into the habit of lunching and dining and partying, doing adieu, there began an inexhaustible conversation about womanhood in all its forms and varieties and permutations, that saw us through several episodes of sexual drought, as well as through some periods of embarrassment of riches. It was not, or not by any means at all, the locker-room talk that you may imagine, although any reader of Martin's novels will know how brilliantly inventive his capacity for bawdry. I refuse to say obscenity, because the obscene is too easy, and besides, it is always either quite humorless or too dependent for its humor on the knowledge that mere infants have of the human anatomy. It might have been anyone. Actually, I'm sure it was our poet friend, Craig Raine, who came up with the appalling yet unforgettable idea that there is a design flaw in the female form, and that the breasts and the buttocks really ought to be on the same side. But it was Martin who went to all the trouble, with deadpan and dead-on acuity, of arguing the respective merits of which side that ought to be. One doesn't necessarily want to see both features walking toward one, for example, but then again it might be dispiriting to see them both simultaneously marching away. As for metaphors, Everybody has at one point seen men standing in front of the pornography section in either a magazine store or a video emporium, but it was Martin who observed these swaying and muttering figures, pulling out and then replacing the contents, and compared it to a wailing wall. He had an instinctive understanding of the relationship between Eros and Thanatos. One winter he was suffering quite badly from flu and left the New Statesman office early to go home. I agreed to walk an abnormally subdued and muffled Martin down the Gaylord Street to Holborn Tube Station. As we trudged along, there was a girl in front of us who looked as if she was walking on beautifully fluted stilts. How might it be? He murmured thoughtfully, with absolutely no leer or solicity. At once, it seemed, he had brightened and straightened and ceased to snuffle.